The hospital monitors screamed as David's lungs filled with fluid, his last chance at life slipping away. Sarah grabbed the consent forms, but the process server blocked her, slamming the papers to the floor. The medical file in her shaking hands held one answer, a clinic name scrawled in red. Their mother had been watching, and now she was gone. The rhythmic hiss of the ventilator fractured into a wet, jagged rattle. David's chest arched off the thin mattress, his fingers clawing at the air as if trying to peel oxygen from the sterile light. Sarah's knuckles whitened against the plastic bed rail. A nurse's rubber soles squeaked against the linoleum, followed by the sharp snap of latex gloves. "Get the crash cart," someone shouted, their voice muffled by a surgical mask. Sarah retreated into a corner, the smell of ozone and antiseptic stinging her nostrils. Red digits on the monitor flickered, plummeting toward 0 while the code blue siren wailed, a mechanical scream echoing her own silent panic. Dr. Aris surged past her, his movements a blur of practiced urgency, pressing a thumb against David's neck. "We're losing the airway," he barked. Sarah's world narrowed to the sight of David's struggling lungs. The leukemia had been a slow thief, stealing his color, his weight, and finally his breath. But this crisis felt different. It felt final. She reached for his hand, but the medical team swarmed the bed like a hive of white-coated hornets, pushing her back. The air in the room felt thick, tasting of copper and old coffee. She watched the green line on the screen flatten into a terrifying horizon of silence. "David," she whispered, the name catching in her throat like a shard of glass. Every beep of the machine felt like a hammer blow against her ribs. She needed to do something, to fix the variables, to adjust the flow of the universe until it favored his survival. But here, in the white glare of the ICU, she was just a spectator to her own tragedy. The hallway outside the room was a blur of motion as Sarah stumbled away from the chaos. Her breath hitched in time with the distant, rhythmic thud of her brother's chest compressions. She fumbled with the crinkled consent form for the clinical trial, her pen hovering over the signature line. This was the Hail Mary, the one thing that could bridge the gap between David's failing marrow and a second chance. A man in a charcoal suit detached himself from the shadows of the vending machines. He stepped into her path, his frame blocking the harsh overhead lights. "Sarah Miller?" he asked, his voice a low, gravelly drone that seemed to vibrate in the floorboards. She tried to dodge him, her eyes fixed on the nurse station where the paperwork needed to be filed. "I have to sign this," she gasped, her voice cracking. The man's hand clamped onto her forearm, cold and immovable as a vice. He thrust a thick manila envelope against her ribs, the paper sharp and intrusive. "You've been served," he said, his expression as flat as a sidewalk. "Domestic relations injunction. You touch that pen, and you're in contempt." The paper in Sarah's hand fluttered like a dying bird. She looked down at the envelope, then back at the door where her husband—no, the man the state now called her brother—was fighting for his life. The legal freeze was a physical weight, a wall of stone built between her and the cure. She felt a surge of hot, jagged anger. This wasn't just a legal maneuver. It was a death sentence delivered in a suit. The scuffle that followed was a desperate, uncoordinated dance of limbs and paper. Sarah lunged for the nurse's station, her fingers clawing for the consent form. But the process server stepped into her path again. He wasn't just serving papers. He was a barrier. Sarah's shoulders slammed into a medication cart, sending vials of saline and plastic syringes clattering across the floor with the sound of 1,000 falling teeth. The smell of spilled rubbing alcohol filled the air. "Get out of my way," she screamed, her voice echoing off the sterile walls. She wasn't a nurse in this moment. She was a cornered animal. She shoved the man, her palms hitting his chest with a dull thud. And for a second, the shock on his face gave her an opening. Subverted, Sarah didn't run for the exit. She ran for the nurse's station, diving behind the high desk. She knew the layout of Duke University Hospital like the back of her hand. If the legal team wanted to freeze her out, she would find the one thing they couldn't argue with: the original intake records. She saw the restricted file lying on the counter, David's primary chart, the one with the red "legal hold" sticker. This was the smart move. If she could find a discrepancy in the original blood work or a clerical error in the kinship filing, she could buy them 48 hours. Her heart hammered against her teeth as she snatched the heavy folder and ducked into a nearby supply closet, the smell of fresh linen and bleach enveloping her. She fumbled with the latch, her fingers trembling. This was it. The proof that the state had made a mistake. She flipped through the pages, her eyes scanning for the familiar markers of David's DNA, the sequences she had memorized over months of treatment. She felt a surge of triumph as she found a sealed envelope tucked into the back flap, a document from the Georgia clinic where they were both born. This was the smoking gun she needed to prove they weren't related. She tore it open, her breathing shallow and fast. Finally, the truth would set them free. She could present this to the judge, dissolve the injunction, and get David his transplant. The relief was a wave of warmth, making her knees weak. But as her eyes settled on the first paragraph, the warmth turned to ice. The document wasn't a birth certificate. It was a laboratory log labeled Project Chimera. She read the words once, then twice, her brain refusing to process the clinical, detached tone. Subject 4A, male, and Subject 4B, female. Genetic compatibility, 99.8%. Origin, synthetic zygote split for longitudinal compatibility study. It wasn't a mistake. They weren't just siblings. They were biological mirrors, created in a petri dish. The clinic hadn't just birthed them. It had designed them to be the perfect match for one another. The accidental meeting in college, the shared interests, the instant bond. It was all a calculated experiment. The file slipped from her numb fingers, hitting the floor with a heavy slap. The truth hit her like a physical blow to the stomach, leaving her gasping for air in the dark closet. She wasn't finding a loophole to save her marriage. She was uncovering the evidence that her entire life was a lie. The state wasn't wrong about their DNA, but they were wrong about the reason. They weren't a family. They were a data set. She felt a sickening sense of violation, as if invisible hands had been reaching out from her past to move her like a chess piece. The very thing she thought would save David, their perfect match, was the proof of their manufacture. She was trapped in a nightmare where the only way to save his life was to admit that their love was a product of a lab. The door to the closet creaked open, and a sliver of harsh light cut through the darkness. Dr. Robert Henderson stood there, his silver hair disheveled and his face etched with a weariness that went bone deep. He didn't look like a doctor in that moment. He looked like a man who had been carrying a secret for 40 years and was finally ready to drop it. He looked at the scattered papers on the floor, then at Sarah's hollowed eyes. "You weren't supposed to find that yet," he said, his voice a low, gravelly whisper. He stepped inside and closed the door, the click of the lock sounding like a gunshot in the small space. Sarah looked up at him, her voice barely a breath. "Who did this to us?" Henderson sighed, the sound a long, slow leak of air. He pulled a small digital timer from his pocket, the one he used for his water intake, and set it on a shelf. It began to tick, a tiny, rhythmic heartbeat. "The donor," he said. "The woman you've been looking for." She didn't back out because she was scared, Sarah. She backed out because the organization told her to. She's been watching you both since the day you left Georgia. She's not just a donor. She's the architect. Sarah felt the room tilt. Every memory of her life, her mother's death, her nursing school graduation, her wedding, felt tainted, as if a stranger had been standing in the corner of every room, taking notes. The pressure began to mount outside the hospital walls. By the next morning, the local news was already running headlines about the incestuous Millers, and a 48-hour deadline had been set by the state. David was to be moved to a state-controlled hospice, a place where Sarah would have no legal standing, no right to touch him, and no way to provide the care he needed. She felt the walls closing in. The air in their suburban home felt stale, the smell of David's cologne lingering on his pillows like a ghost. She spent the night pacing the floor, her green and red ledger open on the kitchen table. But for the first time in her life, she couldn't find a single win to record. She decided to meet a private investigator, a man named Richard Taylor, in a rain-slicked parking lot behind a derelict shopping mall. The rain hammered against the roof of her car, a relentless, percussive sound that drowned out the world. Taylor sat in the passenger seat, smelling of old cigarettes and cheap sugar. He was fidgeting with a packet of Splenda, labeling it with a Sharpie. "You're being followed, Miller," he said, not looking at her. "Not by the cops, by the people who paid for your mortgage." Before Sarah could ask what he meant, a pair of headlights cut through the downpour. A black SUV roared into the lot, the tires screaming against the wet asphalt. The impact was a bone-jarring crunch of metal on metal. The SUV rammed Sarah's sedan, spinning it 90 degrees. Her head snapped back against the headrest, a flash of white light blinding her. "Go!" Taylor yelled. But he was already rolling out of the car, disappearing into the rain. Sarah slammed the car into gear, the engine roaring in protest. She floored it, the steering wheel vibrating violently in her hands. The chase led them through the winding, manicured streets of the Charlotte suburbs, past identical houses with dark windows and welcome mats that felt like a mockery. The SUV stayed glued to her bumper, a predatory shadow in her rearview mirror. She took a sharp turn into a construction site, the tires churning through thick, orange mud. The smell of wet earth and diesel exhaust filled the cabin. She dodged a pile of concrete pipes, the side of her car scraping against a metal fence with a shower of sparks. The SUV tried to follow, but its weight worked against it. It slid sideways, slamming into a heavy excavator. Sarah didn't look back. She kept driving until the adrenaline faded into a dull, throbbing ache in her temples. She was a fugitive now, hunted by the very people who had created her. She arrived at the local archives building an hour later, hoping to find the physical backups of the clinic's records. But as she rounded the corner, the smell of wood smoke hit her. The building was a skeleton of orange flame and black ash. Fire trucks lined the street, their sirens a mournful wail in the night. Through the haze of smoke, Sarah saw a figure standing at the edge of the woods. A man in a dark hood, watching the fire with a terrifying stillness. He didn't move as the roof collapsed, sending a plume of embers into the sky. He was erasing her. Piece by piece, the physical evidence of her existence was being turned to smoke. Returning home was a risk, but she had nowhere else to go. On her doorstep, she found a small, weathered box. Inside was an ancient silver baby rattle, the metal tarnished and cold. It was a message, a reminder of the Georgia clinic. Tucked under the rattle was a formal notice from the state. David would be moved at dawn. The clinical distance she had used to protect herself for years finally shattered. She sat on the porch steps, the rattle clutched in her hand, and let out a sound that wasn't a cry or a scream. It was the sound of a person being hollowed out. She retreated to a secluded motel on the edge of town, the kind of place where the carpet smelled of mold and the neon sign hummed like a swarm of angry bees. She spread the stolen files across the stained bedspread, her eyes burning from lack of sleep. She began to notice patterns she had missed before. Coded financial ledgers, recurring payments from a shell company called The Benefactor. It wasn't just tuition, it was everything. Their first car, the down payment on their house, even the specific hospital where David was treated. They were living in a cage, and the bars were made of money, subverted. Sarah focused her medical mind on a hidden laboratory log she had swiped from Henderson's office. It was a complex series of genetic markers and behavioral notes. She spent hours decoding the shorthand, her nursing training allowing her to see the biological intent behind the jargon. This was the key. If she could prove the genetic matching was a form of medical malpractice, she could sue for an emergency injunction to stop David's transfer. It was a brilliant, logical play. She felt a surge of her old confidence. She would use their own science against them. She felt a moment of pure, crystalline victory as she mapped out the legal argument. She called her lawyer, Jennifer Scott, her voice steady for the first time in days. "I have it, Jennifer. The proof of intent. They didn't just let us meet. They engineered the attraction using pheromone-based triggers and matching HLA complexes. It's a violation of human rights." On the other end of the line, Jennifer sounded ecstatic. "Sarah, this is it. This changes everything. Stay where you are. I'm sending a courier to pick up the originals for the morning filing. We've got them." Sarah let out a long, shaky breath, her shoulders finally dropping. She looked at the files, the messy, ugly truth of her life, and felt a strange sense of peace. The truth was a weapon, and she was finally ready to swing it. The knock on the door came 20 minutes later. Sarah opened it, expecting the courier, but instead found two men in dark suits she didn't recognize. Behind them stood Dr. Eris Thorne, his face a mask of cold, surgical precision. He stepped into the room, his eyes scanning the files on the bed. "A pheromone-based trigger study," he mused, his voice a melodic, terrifying lilt. "An interesting theory, Sarah. But you've misread the data." He picked up the primary log, the one Sarah thought was her victory. "This isn't a record of a social experiment. It's a patent filing. You and David aren't subjects in a study. You are proprietary biological assets." The truth hit her with the force of a physical collapse. The loophole she thought she found wasn't a mistake. It was the foundation of their legal ownership. By proving they were engineered, she hadn't invalidated their relationship. She had confirmed they were the property of the clinic. The organization didn't want to hide them. They wanted to reclaim them. "The state isn't investigating you for incest, Sarah," Thorne said, his knuckles popping in a slow, rhythmic sequence. "They are investigating a theft. You took something that doesn't belong to you. David's body, his blood, his very DNA, it belongs to the investors." He adjusted his tie 3 times. "And now, we're taking it back." Before she could scream, the sirens of the North Carolina State Police drowned out the humming neon. The door was kicked open, and Sarah was thrown against the wall, the cold metal of handcuffs biting into her wrists. The detectives didn't look at the files. They looked at her with disgust. "Sarah Miller, You're under arrest for fraud, identity theft, and the unauthorized transport of restricted medical materials." As they dragged her out of the room, she saw Thorne calmly gathering the files, tucking them into a leather briefcase. He looked at her one last time, his eyes as blank as a winter sky. "Precision," he whispered, "is the only thing that separates us from the dirt." Released on bail the next afternoon, Sarah returned to a house that was no longer a home. A mob had gathered on the sidewalk, neighbors she had shared coffee with, parents from Leo's school, all holding signs that screamed abomination and cleanse the neighborhood. The air was thick with the smell of cheap spray paint and righteous fury. She could hear the rhythmic ch-ch-ch of her neighbors' sprinklers, a sound that used to mean safety but now sounded like a ticking clock. She had to get the children out. She found Leo and Maya in the basement, huddled together under a heavy wool blanket. Leo was counting the stairs in a whisper. 1, 2, 3. His voice trembling. Maya was braiding her hair so tight her scalp was red, her chest heaving in a series of heavy, theatrical sighs. "We have to go," Sarah said, her voice a low, urgent command. She led them to the small basement window that opened into the bushes of the neighbor's yard, the one neighbor who hadn't joined the mob. They crawled through the dirt, the smell of damp earth and rotting leaves filling their lungs, and scrambled into the back of a waiting car just as a brick shattered the front window of their house. Leaving the kids with a trusted friend, Sarah drove toward the mountains, toward a remote cabin where Henderson had promised a whistleblower would meet her. The air grew thinner and colder as she climbed, the dense canopy of pines pressing in on the road like a crowd of silent witnesses. But when she pushed open the door of the cabin, she didn't find an ally. She found Aris Thorne sitting at a small wooden table, a single lamp casting long, distorted shadows against the walls. He was holding a syringe, the needle glinting in the dim light. "You're a persistent variable, Sarah," Thorne said, standing up. He moved with a predatory grace, cornering her against the kitchen counter. But variables can be neutralized. He lunged, trying to press a cloth soaked in sedative against her face. Sarah fought with a ferocity she didn't know she possessed. She felt the sting of his fingernails against her neck, the smell of his expensive cologne mixing with the scent of old wood. Her hand brushed against a heavy oxygen tank standing in the corner, a relic from the cabin's previous owner. She swung it with both hands, the metal whistling through the air. The tank connected with the side of Thorne's head with a sickening, hollow thud. He crumpled to the floor, his eyes rolling back. Sarah didn't wait to see if he was breathing. She snatched his car keys from the table and ran into the night, the biting frost of the mountain air stinging her lungs. She drove like a madwoman, the headlights cutting through the fog that had begun to swallow the road. She needed a real win. She needed something the organization couldn't burn or buy. She broke into the legal archives in downtown Raleigh, using a key card she had lifted from Thorne's pocket. The building was a tomb of glass and steel, the silence vibrating in her ears. She sat at a terminal, her fingers flying across the keys. She wasn't looking for DNA records this time. She was looking for the money. She found the original surrogacy contracts, buried under layers of digital encryption. And there, in the fine print of a document from 1991, she found it. A clause stating that the genetic material was provided by a third-party donor who had never signed away her parental rights. The legal technicality was a thin reed, but it was enough. If the donor hadn't signed, the clinic never had legal ownership of the embryos. Their marriage wasn't a fraud because the entity that claimed they were siblings had no legal standing to make the claim. It was a loophole big enough to drive a truck through. She felt a surge of hope, a frantic, desperate heat in her chest. She began to download the files, the progress bar moving with agonizing slowness. But as she stepped out of the building, the world collapsed again. A fleet of black and whites was waiting, their blue and red lights turning the rain into a kaleidoscope of misery. Michael Brown, the state social worker, stood in the center of the circle, his face a blank wall of bureaucracy. He held a clipboard as if it were a shield. "Sarah Miller," he said, using that terrifying "we" that erased his own humanity. "We have an emergency order. Due to the genetically compromised environment and your fugitive status, we are removing Leo and Maya from your custody. They are being taken to a secure location for their own protection." Sarah watched, paralyzed, as her children were loaded into a black van. Leo's tiny voice echoed through the parking lot. 7, 8, 9. He was counting the steps into the van, his eyes fixed on the floor. Maya let out one final, soul-weary sigh before the door slammed shut. Sarah screamed, a raw, primal sound that was swallowed by the city's roar. But the police held her back. She was alone. Her children were gone, her husband was dying, and she was a ghost in her own life. She returned to the hospital, her feet moving by instinct. The ICU was a fortress of glass and armed security. She stood at the end of the hallway, watching through a gap in the curtains. A nurse inside David's room gave a frantic, jagged signal. A hand slashed across a throat. David had flatlined. The monitors were a chaotic mess of red digits. The security guards moved to block the door, their hands on their holsters. Sarah felt a cold, sharp clarity settle over her. She was a nurse. She knew this building better than the men holding the guns. She didn't try to push past them. She turned and headed for the maintenance stairs, her mind mapping the ventilation shafts and the oxygen lines. She climbed into the dark, cramped space above the ceiling tiles, the smell of dust and warm metal filling her nose. She crawled on her hands and knees, the sound of her own breathing loud in the confined space. She reached the vent above David's bed and looked down. He was gray, his chest still, the medical team standing back as if they had already given up. Sarah kicked the vent cover through. She dropped into the room like a vengeful angel, landing on the linoleum with a heavy thud. The doctors gasped, but she was already moving. She snatched a syringe of epinephrine and jammed it into David's IV line, her movements a blur of practiced clinical violence. "Get out!" she hissed at the resident who tried to stop her. She began chest compressions, the rhythmic thud, thud, thud echoing the heartbeat she was trying to summon back from the void. As the police began to batter the door, Sarah looked toward the glass observation window. A news crew, tipped off by Henderson, was filming everything. She didn't stop the compressions, but she began to speak, her voice clear and resonant, carrying through the hospital's intercom system. She told them everything: the Georgia clinic, the genetic patents, the stolen children, and the man named Thorne who thought he could own a human soul. She turned her life into a public broadcast, a shield made of truth that the bullets couldn't pierce. David's heart gave a hesitant, fluttering kick. Then another. The green line on the monitor began to dance again, a jagged, beautiful rhythm. The police stopped their assault on the door. The standoff had become a spectacle, and in the glare of the cameras, the organization's shadows had nowhere to hide. Months later, the fog of Oregon swallowed the horizon, a thick, gray wall that felt like a sanctuary. Sarah sat on the porch of their new home, a small cabin overlooking the Pacific. The air smelled of salt and damp cedar. David sat beside her, his color returning, his hand resting in hers. He wasn't tapping his ring anymore. He was just breathing, the sound steady and deep. The state had returned Leo and Maya after the national outcry forced a federal investigation into the clinic's practices. The Project Chimera files had been burned in a metal basin in the hospital parking lot, the black ash scattering in the wind. Sarah looked at her husband, the man who was her brother, her mirror, and her choice. The science said they were an experiment, but the science was a cold, dead thing. Their love was the only variable that mattered. As the sun dipped below the waves, Sarah realized that family isn't something you're born into. It's something you fight for until the world has no choice but to let you keep it.